What's up everybody, welcome back, or welcome to the channel if you guys are new. So today I want to talk about replication and explain some basics about multiplayer replication in Unreal Engine. So we're not going to talk about everything that has to do with it because that's just too much. But if you understand the concepts in this video, you should be able to get a start and start working on your multiplayer game. So first of all, it might be useful if you already have some experience with Unreal Engine and multiplayer is not the first thing that you're gonna do, but do whatever you like, obviously. It's just that multiplayer makes everything exponentially more difficult to set up. So all of the examples that we're going to use are based on a listen server model. So the same logic for replication still applies to all other kinds of server setups, like a dedicated server or a peer-to-peer setup. But there are some things to keep in mind, like for example, a dedicated server does not have a player that needs to play FX or sounds, and it doesn't have a character. So there are some differences, obviously, but the logic that we're going to talk about still applies to different kinds of server setups. For the examples in this video, I'm going to use a listen server setup. So I decided to put the camera on for this video so you can look at my ugly face. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that for tutorials because it might be blocking stuff that you want to see inside of the blueprints and things like that. But for this video, I thought it shouldn't matter, and at least you guys can meet the guy who's talking to you. So here I am. Okay, so let's start a little bit by talking about replication. So first of all, what actually is replication? Replication is the sharing of information between different instances of an actor. So it's always between different instances of an actor and never between different actors directly. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that, and we're also going to talk about what actually an instance is, because if you don't know what we're talking about, it's going to make it pretty difficult to understand. So first of all, instances. And I got this example over here. I've used a similar example in one of my tutorial series, but that doesn't really matter. We're going to take a look at this. So first of all, imagine if we are playing a single player game. You should be kind of familiar with that. We have the player, or just the person that actually playing the game, and this represents his computer. And then he's controlling a character in the game, and he has all different kinds of classes to make the game work, like the game instance, the game mode, player controller, animation blueprint, widgets, all that kind of stuff. Now, if we talk about an instance and we actually go into a multiplayer game, let me see, over here for example, then we have two characters in the game, and those are controlled by different players, obviously. So this purple character over here has two instances, one in the server's game over here and a second instance in the client game over here. So there are two instances or copies sort of the same character. So that's what that means, and that's why I say you always replicate between different instances of an actor. So between the purple characters, for example, and you cannot use replication to share information between the purple and the green character. That doesn't really make sense for replication, so then you would just use normal cast or something like that. So those are instances, and that's what we are actually talking about when using replication. Now I made this setup over here. As you can see, there are some things differently between the server and the client. So first of all, I need to move these out of the way. So let me quickly do that over here. Like so. So this is what happens when we have a multiplayer game with a host and one client. So all of the games have two instances of the character, or one instance of the character, but two characters in the game, I'm sorry. So we have a green character from ourselves, and we have an instance of the purple character in our game as well. So that's pretty self-explanatory, but then there are also exceptions. For example, if we take a look at the game mode, a game mode only exists on the server, and as you can see over here, the client does not have a game mode. Then there are also other classes like the player controller to make things even more complicated. A player controller exists on the owning client, so the actual client that's playing the character, and also on the server. So we have two instances of the client's player controller. But at the same time, the player controller for the host or the server only exists on the server. So the server only has one instance of his player controller only locally. And then there's different classes as well, just like the game instance, the animation blueprint, or widgets, for example. Those will never replicate. Those are unique for all players. And so you cannot replicate something between the green game instance and the purple game instance. They simply don't know each other and they cannot talk to each other. So these classes on the left over here for the client and on the right over here for the server, those are unique for every player and you can never use them for replication. So this is a game with a host and one client. Then to make things a little bit more clear, I'm going to show you a second client as well. So then we have this over here. So again, you can see every game has 3 characters and there's one instance of each character in that game, obviously. So we have a red, purple or pink, however you want to call it, and a green character over here. But again, for the player controller for the red guy, that only exists on his local game and for the server. So the server has all player controllers of all players in the game, while a client only has its own player controller and he can never access the green player controller over here, for example. Or we need to replicate it to the server and then have the server do it for us. So that's something to keep in mind. Different classes behave differently, and you need to think about that if you want to use replication properly. So for example, there's no use on putting a replicated event or variable on the game mode because the game mode only exists for the server to begin with. So there are no other instances to replicate anything to. So that simply won't work. And then same goes for the player controller, for example. It doesn't make any sense to use a multicast on a player controller because a player controller only has 2 instances. So you're either going to replicate from the client to the server or you're going to replicate from the server to the owning client. But using a multicast won't do anything differently than any of those events. So always keep in mind what class am I working on and how can I use replication on this class, and can I even use replication. So for example, game instance, animation blueprint, widgets, forget about it. If you want to share information between those, you need to do it through other classes. So for example, replicate it to the character first, make sure all character instances have it, and then share it with whatever blueprint you want. So that's a little side note. And then you often hear people say like the game mode does not exist on clients, so we cannot access the game mode. That's not entirely true. It is true there's only one game mode, but as you can see, we also have a server instance of our character, for example. So if I'm the red guy and I want to access something on the game mode, then I can simply replicate to my server's character over here. And that means I'm on the server's game and then I can access the game mode. So always think about what you actually want to achieve and how you can achieve it by using the correct classes and the correct instance. That's very important. Okay, so now we have these basics out of the way. Let's take a look at some different examples. Before we're actually going to take a look at some examples, there's something really important I forgot to mention over here, and that's the local character or the local controlled character or the local player controller, however you want to call it. You need to understand what that is as well. So we can talk about the host and the client, but all of these have local controlled characters and local player controllers. And that simply means the local or owning client is the instance that is actually controlled by the player with the keyboard. So for example, the local character in client 2's game is the red character, and the locally controlled player controller is the red player controller. But if we take a look at the green game over here for client 1, the local character is the green character, and the locally controlled player controller is the green player controller. So local doesn't actually say anything about being a client or host, because the host has his own purple local character and the purple locally controlled player controller. It simply means that's the actual instance that's being controlled by the player in the case of a character, or the instance that is actually owned by that player, hence owning client. So if we talk about an owning client or a local controlled character, that's the same. So the owning client is always the locally controlled character or the local player control. So that's something very important as well. So keep that in mind. Local doesn't say anything about being host or client. It simply means that's the instance you control or own yourself. Okay, so now we have that out of the way, we can take a look at some examples. So first of all, let's take a look at the most simple thing that you can do, replicate a variable. So I'm on the character blueprint right now. I just created a boolean, some bool, and in event tick, I'm gonna print the result of that boolean on screen so you can see what actually happens. One important thing that you need to take in mind is that if you use a blueprint, in the class defaults, you will need to make sure that replication is enabled if you actually want to replicate variables or use replicated events. So in the class defaults over here, there should be a part called replication over here. And as you can see, this is turned on by default for the character blueprint. So you don't need to worry about it in the third person character, for example. But if you're going to create a new actor, you need to make sure you turn on replicates if you want to be able to actually work with replication in that blueprint. So that's an important thing to take in mind. So now we're going to play with 3 players. So I'm going to set 3 players over here and enable the listen server mode. And then I'm going to hit play, and you will see the print show up over here. So because I hooked up the delta time for the duration, the print doesn't show up for the clients. The frame time is probably a bit longer, but that doesn't really matter. We can see what happens over here. So first of all, you're gonna see 9 different prints, and you might think there's something wrong, but if you think about it and look at the screen, there's actually 9 different 3 different characters with each 3 different instances. So there are actually 9 quote-unquote characters that will print something, and that's why we see 9 prints over here. The server has 3 instances, 1 in each game, and each one of those will put a print on the screen. So we can actually use this as well, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but this is kind of useful to actually figure out how some things work with replication. So there's nothing wrong over here. We have 3 prints for the server, 3 for client 1 and 3 for client 2. Now I'm going to create a keyboard event. So I'm simply going to press 1 on my keyboard, and that will change the bool. So currently it's false, and if I press 1 on my keyboard, I'm going to set it to true. And I didn't do anything with replication. So now if I select the server, press 1, you will see one of these server instances or characters, instances, will have the bool set to true, but the other instances of my character don't know anything about it. And the same goes for the client over here. If I press 1, you will see one instance of client 2 will have that bool set to true, and the others will still think it's false. So if I'm going to set this to replicate it over here, so we select the variable on the right side, we can turn on replication. You will see these 2 little dots pop up to tell you it's a replicated variable. and then we can actually replicate it. So if we hit play again and I'm going to press 1 on the server, you will see that the server instance is true, the server instance on client 1 is true, and the server instance on client 2 is true. So we have the bool replicated in this case. Now I'm going to hit play again, and I'm going to do the same thing, but then hit the keyboard for client 2. And this time you will see only client 2. The owning instance will have that boolean set to true. So this means to replicate a variable, you always need to do it from the server. And because if I'm the server and press 1, then I initiate it from the server, so then it will be replicated. I'm tripping over my own words. But if we do this from a client, this won't actually work. So that's something important to keep in mind. To replicate a variable, always do it from the server instance. Okay, so what do I need to do if I want to replicate something from a client to the server, you might think? There are replicated events that we can use for that, and there are 3 kinds of replicated events. We have a run on server RPC, so RPC is simply short for replicated event. The run on server needs to be called by the owning client or the local player. So the owning client is the same thing as the local player. You want the local player to call run on server RPC, and then it will be executed on the server instance of that character, for example. Then on the other side, we have the owning client RPC. That needs to be called by the server, and then that will execute on the owning client or /local player in the case of a character. And there's also a multicast event that also needs to be called by the server, and that will make it execute on all instances. And there's a side note if they exist, obviously. So as I mentioned in the beginning, for a player controller, that won't do anything extra because there are only 2 instances to begin with anyway. So these are the 3 replicated events that we can use, and I'm going to start by showing an example of the run on server replicated event. In the case that we want to replicate a boolean from a client and make sure that it reaches all of our other instances. So I'm going to make a replicated event. Simply create a custom event, and I'm going to call this replication. Doesn't really matter for now. So if we want to make it replicate, on the right side we have the 3 options that I mentioned, and this also explains what you need to do. So on the end it says only call this from the server, replicate from owning client to the server, and this one, no, it doesn't actually mention it for the multicast. Oh yeah, sorry, multicast server, client to server, and then owning client from the server. So over here it tells you where you need to call it from as well. So we're going to use a run on server RPC, and then we're going to call that after the key press. So simply call the replication event, and we're going to make this change the boolean over here. So now if I try again with the client, then it will actually replicate the boolean because we told the server instance to do it. So I'm gonna select client 2, press 1, and you will see 3 instances of that character will have the boolean changed. The one on the server, the one for client 1, and an instance for client 2. So that's how you can use a run on server RPC. If you want to replicate something like a variable, for example, from a client, make sure you use that one. Then we also have the run on owning client RPC, and I'm also going to show an example of that one. So a run on owning client RPC is often used, for example, because you can use it for other things as well, but it's often used to display something on a player's HUD, for example. So a widget only exists for the local player. It's projected on the screen of the player, so other instances of that character don't actually have a screen to project the widget on. So it doesn't make sense to have a widget there. It only exists for the owning client or the local player, which is the same thing as I mentioned a couple of times. So what I did, I created a simple HUD with a text, and I bound that text to a property on my character that's called some text. So if I want to create a HUD widget for a player, you need to make sure you use the locally controlled branch. So you only want to create it for the local player, otherwise you're going to get errors. And I simply put that HUD on the screen. And then let's say we have a game mode and there is a game that's being played, and at some point you have a player that wins the game and you want to put some text on that player's screen that says you win. But we are the host, so we are on the game mode, and first thing we need to do obviously is actually get an array of the other players that are in the game. In this case those are player controllers. If you look at this, the index 0, so the first player controller that logs into the game, will always be the host no matter what. And in the case of a listen server, if the host leaves the game, then the game will end. So the index in this array, index 0, will always be the host, and then the next indexes will be for the clients that log in. So I've just made a very simple function. It doesn't really do anything except get a client player controller, get the control pawn, cast it to the third person character, and then have a RPC on the third person character that runs on the owning client that will change the text. So this is not a replicated variable, it's just a normal variable because we only actually need to use it on the owning client or the local player. So what we can do now, this will simply execute after 4 seconds after we start the game. So as you can see over here, we have 3 characters, they have hello on the screen, and over here you saw it change to you win. So that's simply because the replicated event over here replicated it back to the owning client, and then we can use that to display it on the HUD. So if I would pick another instance, then for the other client it will change. So over here, client 2, you will see it change to hello, then, like it did. So often run on owning client RPC is used for things like that, where you don't need other instances of the character to know that stuff, and you want to replicate something from the server that has to do with a condition in the game or something like that. So that's how you can use a run on owning client RPC. And then we also have the last one, and that's a multicast, and I'm going to show a quick example of that one as well. So we're back in the character with the key press event. I've created a multicast event, so simply a custom event, and on the right side set it to multicast over here. And multicast is often used to spawn an emitter, play FX, play a sound, things like that you want all players to see. Because after all, if I want to use a variable to change, I can simply use a server RPC and change that variable, and it will change for all instances. But for a multicast, you will use it to spawn an FX, for example, as I mentioned, so I'm repeating myself. So I'm pressing the 1 key and then it will call the multicast event. So let's see what happens. Unresolved compile errors. Okay. Oh, I removed the you win event, so that doesn't matter. Back to the multicast. So if I hit play over here, I'm going to choose the server's character. Spawn in, please. Thank you. And hit 1 on the keyboard, and as you can see in all 3 screens you will see the explosion play. Then if I go back to a client and press 1, you will only see it for the owning client and not for the other instances of that client, because in this case it's not called by the server. So what you want to do if you are a client and you want to multicast, you need to call a server replicated event first, and then have the server call that multicast. So we're going to create a custom event again and call this playFX on the server. With the event selected, we're going to go to run on server, then hook up the multicast, and over here we're going to call the server playFX. So in this case we can use a multicast on a client. So if I hit the key on the keyboard, now you will see it play for all 3 instances. if I actually move the camera, you can see it a bit better. So there you go. So that's how a multicast is often used for spawning FX or sounds, because as I mentioned, if I want to change a variable, I can simply hook it up over here, make sure it's replicated, and then you don't need the multicast. So the variable will replicate because it's set to replicate, but things like FX and sound never replicate, so you can pretty much take it as a base rule that anything cosmetic, also animations or montages that you play, are not replicated by default, and you want to use those in a multicast event. Okay, so those are the 3 replicated events that we can work with. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's pretty important to make sure they are called from the correct instance to make sure they work properly. So sometimes it still might work. So if I'm the server and I call a run on owning client replicated event, that will still work in the same way as I call it from the other side. But in other cases like a multicast, if you call that from a client, it will simply be dropped and it will only execute on the actual character that called it, the instance that called. So there's a pretty big difference there. And we can actually use the prints that we already have been doing a little bit to determine how all these events work. Because to make things a little bit more complicated, different events behave differently. So if we are on a character blueprint, for example, we have the begin play event, and this will execute by default on every instance of the character. So it's sort of a multicast event. But you also have the input events, like if you create an input action, or like I just did with the keyboard pressed event in the event graph. Those will only execute locally. So it depends on if you're the server or the client, and those will only execute on the local instance of that character or controller or wherever you place that event. Then you also have server only specific events, like for example on possess or possess, things like that. And there's also, for example, overlap events. Those are initiated by a component, and on every instance where that component exists, they will execute as well. So for example, if I'm going to go to the viewport and have my capsule component over here, that capsule component will exist for every instance of my character. So if I use an overlap event on this capsule component, that will automatically make it execute on all instances of my character. Now, to make things a little bit easier, because sometimes you're just confused to find out where everything executes and you don't really know where to start, especially in the beginning, you can use the prints that we just did. So for example, if I'm going to go to begin play and I'm going to add a print in here, and I'm going to increase the duration so we can see it. 20 seconds should be plenty. And then hit play. Now you will see the 9 prints that we actually had earlier. So this will tell you it executes on all instances of that character. Otherwise you wouldn't see 9 prints. So there's 3 for client 2, 3 for client 1, and 3 for the server. But on the other hand, if we go to a possess event, so event on possessed, for example, and we're going to hook up the print over here, then you will see 3 prints that will have the server prefix. So the first one doesn't have a prefix because it's the server itself, and then the 2 servers over here. So this event only executes on the server instances of that character. So that's actually a pretty simple way to determine where and how things execute. And there is a little side note, by the way, because I tried this in Unreal Engine 5.3, and all of the clients had the client 0 prefix. So there's a little bug over there, I think. I hope it's fixed in 5.4 or 5.5, but I'm not sure. And it will still tell you how many instances actually executed it, but it's a little bit harder to differentiate between client 1 and 2 because all of them have the client 0 prefix. So that was a bit weird. But in this case, Unreal Engine 5.2, this works fine. So then we have the input events, like I mentioned. So if I'm going to use a keyboard event over here, let's take a look what happens if we hook up the print, compile and play. So if I press 1 on the keyboard for the server, it only I pressed it twice, sorry, that's confusing. It only executes for the server's local instance. Now if I go to client 2 and press 1 on my keyboard, it only executes on the local instance of client 2. So that automatically tells you this only executes local. And for that reason, the only event or replicated event that actually makes sense to call after an input is a run on server RPC, because this is called by the owning client. So if you're going to call run on owning client RPC, it doesn't make sense because we're already doing that. And if you call a multicast event over here, it's not going to execute because I am locally, so that will only work for the server. So that's a pretty simple quote-unquote hack to determine how things work. Now let me show you quickly with an overlap component how that works as well. So I've added a box condition to the character and it's set to overlap all. And I simply use the component overlap begin over here and then print hello on screen. So what happens if we overlap a character, and I need to make sure I only overlap the character and not the actual box component of the other player to make it less confusing. So I'm going to overlap the other player. You will see 3 prints, one for my own locally controlled instance on the server, and then one for my instance on client 1 and one for the instance on client 2. Because as you can see, that box also exists in all 3 of the games. So this component has 3 instances by itself. So it doesn't necessarily replicate, but it does fire on all instances because it simply exists over there. Now we can actually change how that works as well. So if we have the component on the player and, for example, we want to use it for pickups in the level. So if we have a sphere and that overlaps one of the pickups, we want to display the name of that pickup for only the local player, because that's the only one that needs to see it. Then you don't actually need this component on other instances of your player. And that example will also show you that it doesn't actually replicate, but it simply executes on all of the instances where it exists. So what I'm going to do is grab a branch over here. I'm going to check if I'm locally controlled, but I'm going to add a not boolean. So if I'm not locally controlled, I'm going to get rid of the overlap sphere. So plug it in over here. If this is false, do nothing. And if this is true, then I'm going to grab the box, sorry, not a sphere, and I'm going to destroy the component. And then continue as well. So now if we hit play, then you will see only the locally controlled character has the overlap box, not sphere. And the other instances of other characters don't have that box. So if I look at the same character over here in this screen, it doesn't have the overlap box, and over here it doesn't have either. So only the local instance has it now, and then it will only execute for that instance. So it doesn't necessarily replicate, as I mentioned, but for components, it actually matters where they exist, and that will make it execute on different instances. So all things to keep in mind if you work with replication. It's not simply about hooking up a replicated variable and then call it. It's not that simple. It's most of the time just realizing in what event am I, on what blueprint am I, can I replicate from here, does this component replicate, things like that. So that's also how you can use it to your advantage, because in this case then you're also saving well, actually overlap events on the other instances, and you don't need those to fire. So it's not only more easy to understand, but it's also a tiny bit of optimization as well. Okay, so I think that's most I wanted to say about the prints, because that's how you can use them to make replicating a little bit easier. Then we want to take a look at a few small things like RepNotify and also placed actors in the level. So in this case, I put a light in the level, and because it's simply placed in the level, it will automatically show up for all players, because when they load the level, it's there, so it will be loaded. So I did nothing special to it, I just placed it in there, and as you can see, all players can see it. So now if I press 1, I'm simply going to delete the actor. So let's play the level again. And if I press 1 on the server, it will only be removed for the server. And the same goes for a client. I can press 1 over here and it will only be removed in that game. So I mentioned it before, if you want to use replication, you want to make sure that the actual blueprint you're using has the replicates boolean turned on. So if I enable replication for this blueprint and then do the same thing, I'm the server, I'm going to press 1 and it will actually disappear for all of the players. But on the same side, if I do it for a client, it still won't work because it's not called by the server. So now it actually doesn't even delete the light because it's owned by the server and I cannot delete it as a client. So that will only work for the server. If you put the replicated boolean on, there's another thing you could do. For example, simply do this in a multicast event. So if I turned off replication over here, so it's not a replicated blueprint, and then simply create a custom event that's a multicast event. So multicast destroy, plug it in over here, and then turn on multicast. I'm gonna call that, if I press 1, multicast destroy. So this will have the same effect as turning on replication and then doing it from the server. So if I press 1 on the server, it will be removed for all of the clients. So this could be useful if you simply only want to delete an actor, but you don't want to replicate it during the entire game. It's not necessarily needed to turn on replication. In that case, you can use a multicast event, for example, and get rid of the actor. And the same thing goes for spawning an actor. So if I actually spawn an actor that is not replicated, then it will only show up for the actual instance that spawned it. So let's copy this location over here. And then I'm going to say spawn actor from class. And I'm going to spawn the ceiling light. And paste in the location if I can. Cannot. Okay. So 11.11.390. So this is not a multicast and it's not a replicated blueprint. So right now I can simply spawn it for, I need to remove it from the actual level, obviously. So let's get rid of the existing one. There we go. So now it will only spawn for the actual instance that pressed that button. So if I press 1 on the server, it doesn't replicate. And if I press 1 on the client, obviously it doesn't replicate either. Now, if I go back to the ceiling light and turn on replication, then I need to make sure that the server actually spawns the actor. But then if I press 1, you will see it pop up for all of the players. So if you spawn or destroy an actor, you can use a multicast as well instead of turning on replication, depending on how you want to handle that actor. Is there anything else that needs to be replicated on the actor during the game, or do you simply want to delete it at some point and it doesn't actually need to have replication turned on? So obviously if you turn replication off, you will save some bandwidth here and there. And if we want to spawn this from a client, then we actually need to have the server replicated event first. So you can turn on replication over here, but for clients that doesn't affect anything. So if we want to spawn it for everybody when we are a client, then we need the multicast event. And the multicast needs to be called by the server instance. So then we need the server replicated event first. So create a multicast and then create a server replicated event. And that will call the multicast event. And from the client, call the server replicated event. So this will work for clients, and then if we press play for a client, oh, because I haven't turned on replication. Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn on this one. So it's easy to make a small mistake. So replicate it from the owning client to the server, have the server call the multicast event, and this will replicate it to all instances. And this can be turned off right now because we have a multicast event. So now if I press 1, it will spawn for all of the clients. And I can actually leave out the multicast if I turn on replication for the blueprint. And then call it from a client as well. There you go. So there's different ways to actually approach things most of the time. So there's multiple ways leading to Rome, as they say. And so always think about what you actually want to do with the actor and how important is it to turn on replication. Are there other ways that I can maybe do it that will save me some bandwidth and fix it that way? So that's spawning and destroying actor and actor replication in general, because this also goes for replicating variables on this blueprint, for example. That will work in the same way. I need to turn on replication, and then I need to turn on the replication over here for the variable as well. And then as long as the server instance sets this variable, it will be replicated to all of the clients. So it doesn't only apply to spawning or destroying an actor, but also just doing general replication on that blueprint. Okay, so now there is one more thing we probably want to talk about, and that's a little bit more specific, but it's also very useful. It's the RepNotify variable. So over here you can turn on replicated, but you can also turn on RepNotify. So this will make the variable replicate, but there's also a function created when you turn this on. And this function will behave like a multicast, so it will execute on all instances when this variable is changed. So you can do something in this function, like print a string, for example, instead of using a multicast. Now, it's a little bit less bandwidth heavy to use a replicated RepNotify variable, but it also has a little bit more chance to be dropped. So a custom event and RPC is always more reliable than a RepNotify, but it's still useful because it's less bandwidth heavy, and sometimes you just don't really care about it being a tiny bit less reliable. So for example, if you have 50 AI on the screen and you want to play muzzle flashes when they fire at the player, and occasionally one of those will maybe miss a muzzle flash, then there's not a single player that's going to notice it. It's different when you only have one AI on the screen, or 2 or 3, then you will notice it. So it all kind of depends on what you want to do and how you want to achieve it, obviously. So again, this needs to be set by the server for it actually to work. So let's see what happens. Keyboard 1. And then I'm going to change the some bool from false to true. Compile, save, hit play. And I need to print the bool, otherwise we're not going to know what happens. So let's do it on tick again, and then get a print string. Look up the boolean. And then go for delta seconds. So I'm the server, I'm going to press 1, and then you will see the print hello show up at the bottom for all 3 instances of that character. So the bool changed, and that RepNotify function fired, and that actually printed the hello on screen. Now there is a little side note. If I press 1 again and set the bool to true again, so it's already true, and I'm going to set it to true again, it will not fire for the client, because this time the variable didn't actually change, so it doesn't fire off the RepNotify event. So you need to make sure if you want something like this to happen and you're going to use a bool as a trigger, for example, that you can simply flip it around by using a not boolean, and then it will execute every time you actually press the button, because then it actually changed. So now I pressed it once and then I pressed it twice, it's put it back false, true, false, true. So that's how that works. And the same thing goes for using an integer, for example, as a RepNotify variable. If the integer is 1 and I'm going to set it to 1, then the notify function will not fire. So keep that in mind. Sometimes that's annoying, but in the case of a bool, you can hook up a not boolean and use it as a trigger to execute something that you want to do, for example. So that's a RepNotify variable, and then there's also replication conditions to make things a little bit more advanced. And in here you can set the condition. So initial only means that only if a player joins the game, for example, it will replicate that variable from the server to the client to bring it up to date to the current state. So if it was false, but for the server it's set to true, a client joins and he has it set to false, then it will update. You can only fire the RepNotify on owner. You can fire it on everybody but the owner, things like that. So there are replication conditions as well you can play around with, but it's also easy to fall in traps and forget about stuff. So sometimes it's just easier to simply use RepNotify and then maybe use a boolean in here that checks if you are locally controlled or things like that, if you want to filter out certain instances. Okay, so that's the RepNotify. I think we have pretty much the basic stuff covered. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of other stuff that have to do with replication, like ownership and relevancy and things like that. But in the normal circumstances where you just want to start out and create a basic game and play around with replication, this should actually provide you with enough information to get going and to get started. So always keep in mind, what blueprint class am I on? Is this class actually replicated? If not, turn on replication. Does this class exist on all the instances that I need it to exist? Am I using an event? Does that event actually fire on the correct instance before I call a replicated event from there? So those are all things where it starts out, and as long as you keep that in mind while working on it, then you should be pretty okay. Now I'm also working on a new series that's going to start pretty soon. I think I'm almost done with actually working everything out. And in there we're going to apply all of these concepts and a little bit more. So for the actual people that begin working with multiplayer and haven't followed my previous tutorial yet, it's a really good start to actually get the hold of things. So I do have a quote-unquote beginner tutorial for multiplayer, although as I mentioned, I wouldn't recommend starting with multiplayer, so the beginner needs to be taken lightly. But if it's the first multiplayer thing you do and already have experience in Unreal Engine 4, that's Unreal Engine 5, 4, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. That's a pretty good thing to start from, although the other series is almost 100 episodes long and it got a little bit out of hand. So I'm going to create a new series with a pretty basic game that's pretty simple to set up. And in here we're going to explore all of the replication stuff that I just explained, and this is the actual game if you are interested. So we're going to create menus where we can host a game and then search a game, join a game, and all of the stuff in game obviously is going to replicate as well. So currently I'm the only one playing, so the other player is not moving around, but you get the hang of it. And we're simply going to create a simple, well, kind of turret defense game where you need to fight off enemies, and yeah, that's pretty much it. We're going to replicate the health variables, take a look at spawning projectiles, all that kind of stuff, game over conditions. So it's a pretty basic game, but it's obviously not the prettiest game as well, but it will teach you how to use replication and how to set things up. So if you're interested in that, follow the channel and please drop a like so I'll know you're waiting for it, and it'll probably make me work even harder to get things done. So thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you actually enjoyed it and it's actually helpful and you can start working on your first multiplayer game. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.